This is World War III update. Pardon the subpar video production quality as of late. It's the only way you're going to be able to tell whether or not somebody is real or if it's AI by the end of the year is if they look like a tattered, disheveled mess. So, here we go. Now, where should we begin with today's 24-hour news cycle? Okay, there's a lot of stuff that you guys probably haven't picked up on. Let's just start from the most recent bit of information. It appears as though they're going to be closing the airspace in and around Anchorage in the run-up to the phony baloney dog and pony show that will be the Putin-Trump summit come Friday. This location is symbolic, I am told, because Elmendorf-Richardson Air Base is the home to NORAD, which, if you recall, exists pretty much solely as a Cold War relic and is there for the purpose of strategic nuclear defense. In the case of an all-out nuclear war, this is where they scramble the jets to intercept the Russian bombers. It's home to the E-3 Sentry Early Warning aircraft, and so they're going to be closing the airspace there today. Now, I have a lot to say about that particular issue in just a moment, but first, I just want to quickly remind people of something because it occurred to me that I haven't commented on this as of late. But apparently Trump is deploying the National Guard to Washington, D.C. Now, this isn't unprecedented because if you recall, I believe it was under Biden's term, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it then. They were deploying, I'm not sure if it was National Guardsmen, but there was some militant element that was present in the New York subway system, if you guys recall that, right? Now, I think a lot of this has to do with covert civil defense preparations. Apparently, the crime in Washington, D.C. has been statistically demonstrated to be down significantly. In fact, it was down 26% year over year, which is not to say crime isn't still rampant. But I do believe, and I'm speaking as dispassionately as possible, not making any political statements, although this indeed has the ulterior motive of being a political distraction, taking attention away from everything else that is going on or wrong, and not counting all of the other controversial subjects like Epstein and whatnot. But I will say that this seems to be an attempt to try to train troops to get exposure to being around their own population in the cities, and perhaps, just perhaps, they're deploying them to these biggest cities, which, okay, so they happen to be blue cities, whatever. That's not the point I'm trying to make here. The point is that they're trying to prime people and get them accustomed to seeing these types of military fatigues in the streets with firearms, if they're even going to be armed. I don't know the case. It's only 800 troops across a population of 700 people. Nonetheless, I do believe that this is a civil defense preparation for Day X, because remember, that's really all they're going to have. And it might have occurred to them that when we do this whole decapitation strike thing, that there will be reprisal from Russia, and we will have to deal with that in the streets. And how are they going to deal with that in the streets if there's no coordination, if there's been no experience within their ranks of dealing with a civilian population, a Western civilian population, which is rather unique. Now, they've gotten some training on how to deal with people in Ukraine. Mind you, that's a totalitarian dictatorship at this point, and we're fast approaching turnkey totalitarianism in the United States, but we're not quite there yet. With respect to the political aspect of it, whether or not it's necessary, I mean, is it going to address the underlying debaucherous, hedonist nature of our culture that is in decline? Probably not. But will it at least neutralize the criminal element in the short term so that you could potentially focus on education or whatever sort of underlying issues might be preceding this increase in criminality? Maybe, sure. All I care about is that it's a covert prep for World War III. Okay, so let's talk about what is going on in the world. So Trump today came out and said there's going to be very severe consequences for Russia if Putin doesn't agree to stop the war after Friday. That's a pretty bold statement. I think that's a bit of a paraphrase, but more or less, he said there's going to be very severe, and he used that word, severe consequences. So I think what we can take from this, and a lot of people are falling for this whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. It's sad to see, considering what we've seen with the whole Iranian Path to Persia spectacle, where they perfidiously basically welcomed the Iranians to the negotiating table only to totally stab them in the back and try to assassinate the entire leadership. If you don't think the same thing is going to play out here, then my friend, I suggest you take up another hobby. Geopolitics isn't your thing. Now, at the same time, in the run-up to all of this, Russia is incurring strike after strike on their oil refineries, okay? And this is happening on a non-stop basis. Effectively trying to put as much economic pressure on Russia before they go for this talk, which, unless, as I've indicated in previous videos, and I don't want to go back and talk about all this again, unless there was a plan established beforehand, this meeting is absolutely a pointless photo opportunity for Donald Trump. Okay, there's nothing that couldn't have been discussed in person that you can't over the phone. One could make the argument, okay, you got to shake a guy's hand and you got to look in his eyes and you got to read all the nonverbal communication if you really want to get an understanding of whether or not they're sincere. But let's face it, this is just a bunch of temporizing nonsense, attempting to postpone the inevitable clash of both of these nuclear superpowers that it appears as though, if you watch my video that I released before this one, everything seems to be lining up for a NATO decapitation strike. And quite frankly, I think we're entering the Goldilocks phase of that, which may be a very short window, especially if China and that whole Thucydides trap element starts to pay dividends for Russia. This may be the West's best time. Now, I'm not saying that Putin is going to get blasted out of the sky or shit's going to hit the fan, or even if it's going to be attempted to be sidelined by some malign actors who perhaps want to sabotage the whole thing. But I'm just saying that there's going to be a golden opportunity for NATO to execute their decapitation strike plan. And I believe that we're entering into that zone. They could probably do a little bit more attritional work on Russia's economy and in terms of the various defense elements. And we don't know, with respect to submarine warfare, what their coverage of that is. But I suspect that they're getting pretty close to being able to do a preemptive strike whilst minimizing collateral damage. But a lot of that comes down to dead hand. Now, Putin is going to be there with Lavrov. Who does that leave in charge of the kingdom? I guess you got the defense minister, you got I think even the prime minister might be going as well. And then you got Medvedev, okay? So I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but that is effectively what you have going on. Now, when you actually look at the demands of both sides, it doesn't seem as though Putin has made any concessions here whatsoever. The Ukrainians and the Americans are wanting a ceasefire beforehand, which seems like both sides are proposing things that they know the other side is not going to agree to. Why would Russia agree to a ceasefire when they're the ones who are advancing, albeit at a snail-like pace, on the front lines and are about to encircle one of the logistical linchpins of the whole battlefield? Why would you want to put a ceasefire? It becomes clear when you look at the timing and the rapidity of all of this planning that it's very likely that NATO forced this meeting because they knew that something substantial was about to happen on the front lines. Now, we've been hearing this for years and years, and quite frankly, I don't think that NATO is going to allow Ukraine to collapse militarily. If they want, there's a lot more they can bring to bear. Contrary to what a lot of people say, there's still thousands upon thousands of Abrams tanks in storage, thousands of aircraft. There's so much assets that they've yet to deploy. They just haven't. Probably because there are some unspoken, unwritten red lines that we perhaps are unaware of, the real red lines, okay? But they're not going to let Ukraine collapse. It's not going to be over by the end of next year. It's probably not going to be over. You know, gold's probably going to hit 50,000 before this thing is truly over, unless it goes nuclear beforehand. Now, here's what Putin's demands are. They're saying that they want they're willing to do a pullback from Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, and Sumy, which are very smaller territories of land that they've managed to capture, largely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Ukraine's non-NATO commitment, this is what they want, is Ukraine's non-NATO commitment. They're not going to join NATO. They're going to be demilitarized. And that one right there just basically makes this whole thing, it's not going to happen. Ukraine is not going to agree to demilitarize. I mean, that's a non-starter if I ever heard one. Federal reform, bilateral U.S.-Russia deal excluding Ukraine and the EU. If refused, halt all U.S. aid to Kiev and European weapons sales. So, Trump and the Americans are trying to do this thing whereby they extricate themselves from this conflict and they just say, okay, we're not going to participate anymore, but we're going to sell hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons to the Europeans to kill you, all right? And that's going to absolve us of any sort of strategic responsibility in this play. And if you want to go to nuclear war with Europe, have at her, right? Well, that's not going to fly either because, of course, there's a bit of an extortion racket at work here whereby the benefactor is the United States, and thus they're basically establishing a Euro protectorate, so they have to effectively come to the defense of their bitch. It's like, the U.S. is the pimp, and Europe's the bitch, and they got to come to defense if the transaction doesn't go according to plan. I don't know if that's the best analogy, guys. It's late, okay? So there's been accusations that Ukraine is plotting a false flag. I think this is information that the Russian media puts out there in the run-up to any major exchange just to, put it out there so that if something does happen, then they can reference that as, well, we told you that they were going to do some crazy shit, and here you go, even if it was, in fact, the Russians that do it. But I can't see them, striking a hospital the day before. That just would make no sense whatsoever. So if that happens, I think there's a distinct possibility that it may be a false flag. All right? I'm not saying that one entirety in 100% certainty, but there's a very strong possibility. Zelensky confirms the first Russian ceasefire signal via Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff, but rejects any concessions. All right? So they're not wanting to pull back from the Donbass. Apparently, I've heard, and this is from a U.S. pundit, general propaganda talking head, I think his name is Jack, I can't remember what his name is, but anyways, he basically said that if Ukraine pulls back from the Donbass, then that creates vulnerabilities around Kharkiv, I don't care how you pronounce it. So this is part of the reason why they can't retreat, because it basically creates vulnerabilities everywhere else. And so you can see how much of an entangled situation this is. When Trump said that the Armenia-Azerbaijan situation was on par with this in terms of its complexity, that's completely either disingenuous or just an ignorant statement. We're talking about nuclear-armed nations or nations backed by nuclear-armed nations with much larger populations than that. I mean, it's not even close in terms of the geopolitical significance. Okay, where should we go next? Now, I wanted to talk a bit about this a little bit earlier, but apparently, and this is significant as well, because of all of the history of Trump and Putin with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty falling out. Well, Russia is preparing a Burvestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile test at Novaya Zemlya. Now, this thing can potentially, I think, travel 40,000 kilometers. So really, it's an ICBM in a way. I mean, it can go anywhere in the planet. It can loiter around for extended periods of time. And they're calling it invincible. Mind you, I don't think they've done a successful test as of yet, but they're getting ready to test it, and that is according to Western media. They're getting ready to do this test, and this is going to be timed with the breaking ground on the Golden Dome, which, of course, is another antagonistic move by Donald Trump if you're Russia. Not only are we going to get these guys to kill you, but we're also going to put up this, what we are calling a impenetrable Golden Dome strategic defense system. Well, I can understand why the Russians might be slightly skeptical. Now, you wouldn't know that by looking at the Russian media, where they're totally pandering to Trump. And it's clear as day that every single Russian news media agency right now has been given the directive to not criticize Trump. Be as nice to Trump as possible, because we have to make him think that, we believe in this meeting and that we actually believe that the West is trustworthy. So it's as clear as day. Otherwise, you would have so many people who would be much more critical of Vladimir Putin going there for this trip. And as much as I think there's two ways that you could navigate this type of situation. You could use the standard fare form of a statecraft and gradual diplomacy that likely wouldn't go nowhere and would have us in a perpetual Cold War, probably for the next couple decades. Or you can do the more impetuous style of diplomacy, if you can call it that, whereby you swing from one extreme to the next. One day you're talking about nuclear submarines, the next day you're talking about having a face-to-face conversation. Well, what do you think the downslope of that roller coaster is going to look like? And this is what I've warned about for the longest time. I've said, yeah, they're going to get together, they're going to shake hands, and at this point in time, I have no reason to doubt my intuition. The exact same thing happened with Biden in 2021. You always meet with your adversary at some high level before really fully going to war. And that is exactly what happened in, I believe it was June of 2021. Then the United States extricated itself from Afghanistan circa that period of time. And then, wouldn't you know, we just so happened to get into a war 6 months later. This is going to be the exact same thing. In fact, the same thing happened with Kim Jong-un. Remember when Trump had that historic photo shoot and they had all the pomp and flattery by the North Koreans who welcomed Trump, and then lo and behold, just a few months later, the North Koreans fired off more missile defense exercises, not missile defense, but I think they were doing ballistic missile testing at that point. They did more ballistic missile testing after that Trump visit than they had in all previous years combined. And that was just in the next 2 years after the visit. So all these meetings really do is, especially if you don't have a game plan, they just make things worse. And that's what's going to happen in this case. It's going to make it much, much worse, because this is the Trump card. This is the last card you play before going to war. And I mean really going to war. You introduce the lower officials. And the reason why you don't burn this card, and the reason why Vladimir Putin has been so reluctant, because he knows full well it would be like, let's say you're in a bad marriage, and I don't know, you just say, okay, let's go and let's work this out. We're just going to look eye to eye and work this out. And it's been, years and years and decades of maybe fighting with one another. And you just say, okay, we're going to make a time and we're going to work it out. We have no plan whatsoever, but we're just going to work it out. Unless something has been worked out in the back channels, unless there's some really good marriage counselor who is orchestrating this whole thing, chances are it's just going to, whatever you've done, you've burned that last card. It's probably not the greatest analogy, guys. I'm terrible at metaphors, aren't I? I think you get the point. We could see a wild undulation in the other direction when this doesn't work out, which it won't, because it's just there to buy time for both sides. In fact, I think Russia is so desperate for time that even the week alone, even if the whole thing goes to shit on Saturday, at least it'll have some political inertia that maybe they can draw it out a couple weeks afterwards, and maybe they're going to make some big announcement. It's going to be like, oh yeah, Putin, they're going to totally twist the words and they're going to say something's official when it isn't. Putin has agreed to building out the infrastructure in, butt crack nowhere, Alaska. It's going to cost them billions of dollars that we're withholding to build out infrastructure so they can mine our rare earth minerals, or some complete and utter nonsense like that, only to have us basically expropriate it down the road when the next guy gets into office and we decide that we're going to war with you again. I mean, this is just fantasy. This is stupid, you know? Nothing, and I'm not just being pessimistic, this is just reality. Now, had there been, and why there's no publication of potential progress on tangible deals being made, if there was that in advance of this and they were going there to sign something, to officiate it, that would be hard to not be a little bit optimistic about. But this, yeah, there's nothing going on here unless they're doing everything in secret, which really wouldn't make a lot of sense if you were making that sort of progress diplomatically in the shadows. And don't say, oh, well, Trump's trying to do it to hide it from the deep state. I mean, guys, if you still believe that at this point, he's got his, that former hooker, prostitute, whatever her name is, going around talking about the Book of Enoch and aliens and shit like that. And you know, they're supposed to be talking about drones and Fort Knox and Epstein. And what are they feeding you? A bunch of mumbo jumbo. So if you still believe that this guy is bucking the deep state, then again, just remain forever subdued by the proverbial matrix. Okay, so we got Russia preparing the Burvestnik nuclear power cruise missile test. I also heard today that they're going to be doing a miniaturized version of the Orezhnik, but take that one with a grain of salt. So miniaturized Orezhniks being moved to Ukraine. They're going to be doing Orezhnik tests out of this Belarusian exercise that is upcoming, and that's going to happen in mid-September, and they're going to be simulating nuclear strikes. Okay, that is confirmed by Belarusian official. So Zapad 2025 exercises, Russia, Belarus are going to be conducting nuclear strike drills on NATO, leveraging the Orezhnik hypersonic missile platform. There is a record 12 Pantsir S-1 air defense systems, 20% of Moscow's total, surrounding Putin's Valdai residence as per satellite analysis. 20%. Okay, so you're telling me, this is what makes no sense. You're telling me that he's got 20% of the air defense around his house, and this guy is going to Alaska, where, remember, the only way Ukraine can do the targeting is if they get the green light from NATO. So, and if they can leverage, NATO satellites and various means of doing, controlling these things. So, how is it that Putin is so paranoid in one instance and not in the other? And don't say, oh, Ukraine and the United States are misaligned. No, they're 100% aligned. They don't do anything without the U.S. being greenlit. In fact, the ISR aircraft, the Poseidon manned aircraft, is flying very close to some of these residences. So, it just makes no sense. And you think that Putin is trustworthy enough to go to Alaska, but he's got 12 air defense systems surrounding his house? Interesting. According to Alexander Dugin, formerly known as Putin's brain, he warns that Russia risks becoming a headless chicken. When you cut off a chicken head, it still keeps running. I think we will see something similar here, he says. Is he referring to a decapitation strike with Vladimir Putin? Because remember, the problem with a centralized, highly authoritarian society, some people don't like it when I say that, but I always go back to, okay, while it might be true that Russia doesn't have the cultural degeneracy that we have, you still can't protest. And, free speech is most certainly limited, and that's no more evident than looking at Russian media for the last few days, where nobody is critical of this upcoming visit because they've been told to play a part. So I agree that this centralized form of governance, if it is ever taken out, you're far more susceptible to a decapitation strike, especially if you don't have an immediate successor who has the respect and the same amount of, can instill the same amount of fear and has the same cunning as Putin himself. And the successor to Putin is a subject of debate in many circles in terms of the real successor. I suppose it depends on if you think Putin is really the one in power as well, because some people think he's, still at the whim of the oligarchs, as the Americans are with the deep state here. But anyways, so here's what else is going on in Ukraine, okay? So we have Russian forces preparing major offensives, according to Zelensky. He's saying this, that they're preparing major offensives in Zaporozhye, Pokrovsk, and Novopokrovsk sectors, redeploying 30,000 troops from Sumy. He warns that the strongest brigades of the Russian armed forces will launch a major offensive in 3 directions at once. So this is not at all promising for a ceasefire. It really starts to look like you're just asking for a ceasefire so you don't potentially lose it all, right? Now, okay, I was going to go down a rabbit hole of whether or not NATO troops will enter and the dynamics there, but I don't think I will. Let's just continue with the news here. Ukraine has rejected a withdrawal from the Donbass in exchange for a ceasefire, with Zelensky stating, "We will not leave Donbass. If we leave of our own free will or under pressure, it will lead to the beginning of a third war." Okay, interesting perspective. So there we are. This is basically DOA, dead in the water. There was a fire that was reported near Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and this was pretty obvious. There was smoke coming, what appeared to be very close to those steam stacks. I can't remember what they're called, but yeah. So shit's hitting the fan there, and I'm not sure if you guys know, but it's very dry in Ukraine right now, like unusually high temperatures. In fact, all throughout Europe, that place is burning down. And in Ukraine right now, it is incredibly, like extreme levels of drought in many places. And I'm actually surprised that we're not seeing wildfire not weaponized more than we're seeing now. I did a in-depth video on asymmetrical warfare probably 2 years ago, and that was one of the lesser known tactics utilized in war, is starting forest fires. And in fact, I'm surprised that Ukraine isn't using their drones to start forest fires in Russia. Maybe they are and we just don't know about it, but that would tie up a lot of Russian resources as well. It wouldn't be hard to start fires in Siberia in a drought. Ukrainian special forces destroyed a Russian Skala M radar in Crimea, as confirmed by satellite imagery, weakening Moscow's air control. Again, this is just another nail in the coffin in terms of Russia's strategic defense capability. I mean, they're kicked out of Syria, the southern flank's compromised, they lost that corridor in Azerbaijan and Armenia, so they lost the Caspian Sea. Iran is in a state of disarray. They're struggling with a drought. You have the president begging for water from various countries, really appearing quite weak on the international stage. They're about to impose snapback sanctions at the end of August, which the country has said is going to be absolutely financially devastating, and you could bet that that's what they're going to go for, and they're going to try regime change once again. This time they'll have more turncoats because, of course, the Iranian government won't be able to pay people as well as you need to pay people not to turncoat, right? Interestingly, Zelensky has eased martial law, but only if you're under the age of 22. Now, the current conscription age is 25 and above, more or less. It was brought down from 27 to 25. So they ain't letting the 23 to 25-year-old men go yet. So now you're able to leave if you're under the age of 22, which is interesting. That's bullish for peace, I must say. But above and beyond that, I mean, there's not a whole lot going on here, which bodes well for Ukraine. Europe is expanding its arms factories at a historic scale, adding 7 million square meters of industrial space since 2022, 3 times the peacetime pace. Program boosts ammo from 300K to 2 million shells a year by 2025. I'm not sure how many shells that the Russians are firing every day. At one point, it was like in the tens of thousands. So 2 million sounds like a lot, but is it really a lot? But of course, Russia can't sustain that forever. And if you're boring from North Korea, that means that there is a finite amount of shells to go around. As I indicated in my video before this one, the US indeed has deployed 3 B-1B Lancer bombers to Norway's Orland base. So they are there to integrate with Norwegian F-35s ahead of the Russia-Belarus SAPAD 2025 exercises, where they're going to be simulating nuclear strikes with the hypersonic weapons. Poland is converting Baltic Power wind farm into NATO surveillance hub with radars and sensors, citing Russian hybrid threats like Nord Stream and sabotage. So they're leveraging civilian infrastructure militarily, which is new. Lithuania is training 22,000 citizens, including 8-year-olds, in drone construction operation for civil resistance. This is like Ender's Game meets Toys, that movie with Robin Williams. But I don't think we're going to see, I really don't even see why you need manual drone operators at all at this point. This seems to be something like AI should be able to do better than humans. You think you'd be able to master that, where there's no real obstacles in the sky, with the exception of, some trees when you're going on the lower grounds. But in an open field, AI should be able to effectively track a target and neutralize it with a drone way better than a human, one would suspect. So I guess it's they're so what that means then, to me, that means they're training for the short term. They think something's going to happen soon, because in 5 years that's going to be fully automated. Germany eyes Europe's strongest army conscription revival. So they're going to start talking more seriously about conscription in the coming weeks ahead. U.S. is relocating AWACS from Alaska's Elmendorf-Richardson base amid concerns over Putin's visit. That's interesting, isn't it? And lastly, I know I've been focusing a lot on Russia and Ukraine lately, but apparently there's a massive military buildup in the Middle East, and Israel has called up, I believe it's 250,000 reserves or something, in addition to the army they already have active. Now, is that just for subduing the Gaza Strip? Possibly, or potentially they're about to expand the war into Lebanon. They had the Iranian defense minister in Lebanon today as a show of solidarity with Hezbollah, I presume. So we could, in fact, see the Iranian war flare up. We will see it flare up again. It's just a matter of when. If you buy into the strategic sequencing argument, then you believe that they have to effectively put this Russian war on ice, at least in the sense that the United States is not directly involved, even though NATO will be involved, but potentially Europe takes a greater lead. But that seems insufficient, because the outcome would be the same, one would presume. But it seems as though they're trying to do some last-minute thing with Putin, and then it's going to really dictate as to whether or not they go to war on two fronts or one, because it seems time is of the essence for these guys. China's gold demand hits a record high, 36 tons for delivery on Shanghai Futures Exchange, an all-time high. This is signaling obvious economic hedging. And despite the walkback of the Swiss gold bar tariff story, gold persists at around $3,400 in futures trading. Above that, in fact, it was $3,420. It might be lower than that now. Anything over $3,300 is, pretty bearish in terms of instability. Crypto is ramping up, and I suspect that could have something to do with the fact that, as our guest on the channel, Clem Chambers, had articulated, it is for flight. So Bitcoin is for flight and gold is for war. So if you are thinking that things are going to become unstable in pick a country, then you're going to load up on crypto. But usually that transaction is temporary, but it can temporarily elevate the price. Mind you, inflation is running rampant, and maybe Bitcoin is just catching up, because these markets, they're beyond the realm of what can be understood. It's like they operate on a different form of physics, and they've transcended our quantum realm, and they just operate on their own principles, irrespective of any sort of historical precedent. They seem to just be, you can't understand these markets through any rational lens. There's no reason why it should persist at record high levels of on every possible metric of overvaluation in a current climate like the one we live in. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think, eventually either that's a sign, I don't know if that's a sign that you're about to turn a corner with a bus, maybe, or we just keep going and it hyperinflates and we're in a melt up. Maybe that's what it is. Who knows? Yeah, and I already talked about the National Guard being deployed in DC as a covert civil defense initiative. I think that's what it is. If we start to see that happen in more cities, then I would be very concerned. I've gotten messages from people saying that there's some weird stuff going on in terms of government planning and they work on various municipal boards in the United States, and they all tell me the same thing, that they're preparing for something, okay? Apparently, Ukraine is getting ready to propose an aerial ceasefire. Now, I've heard this before. I just don't know who this would necessarily benefit, because when they're talking about aerial ceasefire, they're talking about long-range drones and airstrikes. They wouldn't be talking about artillery. They wouldn't be talking about the smaller drones, loitering munitions, what do you call them? Quadricopter type style drones that you fight infantry and various mechanized material with. This would be mostly for the heavy duty stuff, and I don't see how Ukraine would stand to benefit from that unless they have a more formidable quadricopter, drone presence. Maybe that's the case, but it seems like this is another one of those things that is a non-starter that's just being proposed to show that you are trying to at least be cooperative with this. But we'll have to see. At this point in time, I think Trump has just used the Trump card way too soon with reckless abandon, and that it is going to ultimately result in a much worse situation. But hey, if it has to come, then at least we're prepared, right? Thanks for watching, my friends. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Check out the Canadian Prepper channel for actual prepping information. Take care.